All right, in this video, we are going to look more at the politics of the 19th century. In the last video, if you're following these in chronological order, we talked about industrialization and the effects that it had on society. So we're going to back up a little bit and look at the politics, particularly the politics starting after the meeting at the Congress of Vienna ends the Napoleonic era. And the general title that I give to this video that I'm making right now is going to be the conservative order and then the challenges to it. And so what we are going to do is we're going to look at the politics of conservatism that are put in place after the Congress of Vienna, and then when groups emerge that begin to challenge those sorts of things. Okay, so the topics of the course description that we will cover is going to be 6.5, 6.6, and 6.7. It should not take as long as the last video if you're nervous about that. But you probably aren't, because you can see the runtime on these videos before you push play. So just forget I said that. All right, so first thing first, 6.5, Concert of Europe and European conservatism. The big picture is we want to look at the established conservative order and then know what the challenges to that are in the 19th century. All right, so if you remember, the Congress of Vienna was a meeting after the Napoleonic Wars. It was led by Metternich, an arch-conservative leader out of Austria, and it is going to promote peace and order and stability and traditional sources of power, the monarchies of Europe, the protected nobility, the church, all those sorts of things. So in the 19th century, conservatism for the first time is really going to develop into a movement that is unified behind traditional political and religious institutions. If you remember, before the French Revolution, you had monarchy and aristocracy in the church, but they were often at loggerheads with one another, the nobility fighting for power and trying to take power away from the monarchy, resisting attempts at centralization, those sorts of things. But now they can't do that anymore, right? The French Revolution showed that these institutions were vulnerable, and only by uniting together could they sort of beat back the forces of liberalism and nationalism and those sorts of things. So conservatism is going to be based on a few things. Number one, the idea that human nature is not perfect, right? They're going to reject this Enlightenment notion of the inevitability of progress, of the increasingly, if you increasingly use rationality, you can improve human life to where it will be perfect and whatever. They're going to say, no, 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 humans are not perfect and human society is not perfectible. And then the second pillar of conservatism is going to be, like I said, that the traditional sources of authority are the best. It is the monarchy, the nobility, the state-sponsored church. They worked for centuries. And then you had these radicals come along to try to redo society in a more rational image. And what did you get? You've got the radicalism of the French Revolution, the Jacobins, and then Napoleon, right? And that is going to be their attack on these things. It's going to be the traditional argument that drives me crazy, but it's always been this way. So therefore, that's the only way it can be, right? That's a conservative argument. Some notable conservatives that you should know: Metternich, obviously he's the architect of the Congress of Vienna. You should know him as a pillar of conservatism. And then Edmund Burke. He was very vociferous in his opposition to the French Revolution, and he will be a leading voice of conservatism in the 19th century as well. So Burke and Metternich. You see those names in a quote or in a DDQ for this year, you should know that they are going to be espousing conservative values. All right, so the Concert of Europe is a consequence of this sort of conservative backlash that we see to the French Revolution. The Concert of Europe was a group of European nations, very conservative in nature, led by Russia. Really, they're going to be the big promoter of this, but also Austria-Hungary and Prussia. And they are going to seek to maintain the status quo that has been created through collective action. Basically, revolution in one nation threatens peace and stability everywhere throughout Europe. So we are going to get involved and act proactively to tamp down any liberal or nationalist uprisings that threaten the international order that we have worked so hard to maintain. So the goal of the Concert of Europe, like I said, is to suppress these nationalist and liberal movements that might arise, and we're going to see it done through collective action. For example, in Spain, in the 1820s, I think like 1821, a military coup overthrows the king and forces him to accept a liberal constitution. France, acting on the or at the behest of this concert of Europe, goes in and undoes those changes. And this is new. France isn't doing this for their own personal gain. They're doing it to maintain the status quo. German student nationalist groups are going to rise up and call for unification and liberal policies in the German states, and Metternich is going to issue the Carlsbad Decrees, which basically shut down any communication between German students in different states, putting the kibosh on any talk of unification. And there are many, many more. All right, now the members of this, like I said, Russia, Austria, and Prussia are the big three that dominate this concert of Europe. Another example of their conservative nature is the policy of official nationality that we see inside of Russia. Basically, Russia is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, but they are going to promote Russian language and culture. They're going to promote the Orthodox Christianity faith. They're going to promote loyalty to the Tsar as the pillars of Russian stability. We're not like those Western European states with their radicalism and craziness. We have traditional authority, and that's what makes us better than them. That's sort of the idea behind official nationality. It's a great example of the commitment to conservative ideology that we see during this time. All right, there you go. 6.5. See, told you it's going to be short. 6.6. There are going to be reactions and revolutions against the conservative order that is put into power. Although this sounds exciting, as you know, if you remember, the revolutions of 1848, the biggest revolutions to come out of this, are all going to end in spectacular failure for the liberal and nationalist groups that undertake them. So while there will be challenges to the conservative order, mostly the conservative order is going to maintain its position in power. And then later on, those conservatives in power will begin to adopt piecemeal some of the ideas that they had once so vociferously opposed. Okay, so what are some of the challenges that we see? Well, there are nationalist and liberal challenges that we will see in the first half of the 19th century. Greek independence becomes a major issue. Greece is a part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is a Muslim-dominated, a Muslim empire dominated by Turkish-speaking peoples. The Greeks, who are Orthodox Christian and Greek, not Turkish, don't want to be a part of this multinational empire where they are treated as second-class citizens. And the Ottoman Empire is weakening, and they can't hang on to their territory. And so Greece is going to proclaim independence. Now, the question is, should the European powers allow this, right? Because nationalist success in one place will embolden nationalists everywhere else. And that's bad news for places like Austria and Russia that have restless minority groups living within them. However, Greece sort of tugs at the heartstrings. It's the birthplace of Western civilization, of democracy, of all these sort of liberal ideas that many Europeans feel are really important. And the Ottoman Empire, you know, Muslim empire, we don't really like Muslims in European society. A long history of enmity between, you know, Christianity and Islam eventually leads to them supporting Greek independence. But showing you the conservative nature of it, they appoint a Bavarian duke to be the first king of Greece. So we're not going to see like a republic in Greece or anything like that. Another nationalist rebellion that will not have as much success as Greece is Poland. In 1830, inspired by the French Revolution that happens in 1830, the Poles try to rise up against the Russians. They get crushed. And Russia basically says Poland is an integral part of the Russian state, and they are not going to be allowed to maintain any sort of autonomy or independence from us. Now, there are also liberal movements as well. The Decembrist Revolt is where military officers in Russia, who had been stationed in France after the Napoleonic Wars, who had seen the benefits of liberal reforms that the French Revolution enacted inside of France, stage a coup, trying to force the Tsar to adopt liberal reforms of the Russian state. It is crushed by military force, and so no liberalism in Russia. Also, the July Revolution of 1830 in France, it's going to replace the Bourbons and the hated Charles X, who was kind of an arch-conservative, with a more liberal monarchy led by Louis Philippe, the Orleans monarchy as it's known. And so France kind of is still the leading liberal state that we see. Okay, Then we have the big sort of climax of revolutions in 1848, where a series of revolutions beginning in the urban areas of many of these states are going to shake the foundations of their conservative order. And many times the governments are going to have to flee, like the Habsburgs have to leave Vienna, only to reclaim territory, reclaim order, reclaim control as the liberal and nationalist groups who lead these revolutions splinter and fall apart. Now, honestly, the course description doesn't go into a lot of detail about these revolutions of 1848. So I am not going to go in depth. We'll just cover what the course description says. So first, what are the causes of these revolutions? There are economic hardships going on in many European nations. Remember, I talked about the Hungry 40s. There were a series of bad harvests. This is often a harbinger of revolution. Empty bellies lead to revolution. Also, there was a desire for political reforms, either greater liberalization of autocratic regimes or nationalist passions wanting to create autonomous states within their empires that are going to lead to these. Think of the Hungarians in Austria-Hungary or the Italians being motivated by nationalist passions. So what we see here is the effects of the revolutions of 1848 are basically nothing. There are no permanent changes really, except for in France, where Louis Napoleon, who will soon become Napoleon III, takes over and the creation of the Second Republic. And so you're thinking like, hey, look, liberalism, they got to win. The Second Republic lasts for like 4 years, and then Louis Napoleon becomes Napoleon III, the leader of the Second French Empire. So no permanent changes, although the Habsburgs are going to be challenged the most by this. With the help of others, they are going to put down all the revolutions that take place, and the status quo will be maintained. In fact, liberalism is going to be weakened by this. The best example of that is the Frankfurt Parliament. They met for a year, came up with a liberal constitution that would unify Germany, offered it to the Prussian emperor, and he was like, nah, fam, don't want that. And it broke up, and nothing happened. A big problem with the revolutions of 1848, they're led by liberal leaders who want laissez-faire economic policies, but they rely on working class support who want greater socialist regulation of the economy and redistribution of wealth. It's what's known as the social question. Will you address this inequality that industrialization creates? And at this time, the liberal elite leaders are like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. And so these revolutions fail. Okay. Finally, we have the beginnings of Russian reform that takes place during this time period. Russia is uber conservative up until the 1860s. In 1856, they get defeated in the Crimean War. It exposes Russian weakness. The traditional Russian way of doing things are making them fall behind the West, and it's endangering them. And so they will undergo a series of reforms instituted by the autocratic czars. That's the key phrase there. These revolutions come from the top. The czars are going to do them, and they are mostly economic. They are not going to address any political reforms, and so Russia will remain an absolute monarchy, an autocracy, and that is going to cause problems, as we shall see. So the causes of Russian reform, just the Crimean War, basically, and just the old-fashionedness of Russian society. Events that we are going to see: the abolition of serfdom in 1861. If you remember, Russia frees the serfs, but because they don't want to upset the nobles too much, they paid the nobles for their serfs, but the serfs then have to pay back to the state. Ultimately, nobody is really happy from this. The serfs feel like they haven't gotten free because they're saddled by immense debt. The nobles are salty because their property got taken away from them. And so, yes, they're freed, but no, it doesn't really work out all that great. We will also see extensive building of choo-choo lines. Sergei Witt is the Russian minister in charge of finance. He is a railroad man himself, and so like the Trans-Siberian Railroad was built during this time. The beginnings of industrialization are occurring. Important names to know: Alexander II, he's the one who frees the serfs. He will eventually be assassinated by radicals who are angry at the slow pace of reform. And then Count Witt, or Sergei Witt, he is going to be the sort of architect of Russian railroad construction. The effect of this will be some industrial growth, some economic change taking place in Russia, although they will still remain quite far behind the rest of Europe. But what this is also going to do is it's going to produce radical groups who do not like the pace of reform, who want to push it even further ahead. Those radical groups will be persecuted and suppressed by the Tsar state, which will lead to greater radicalization. And so we have building societal tension inside of Russia, which we're not going to get to because we're not talking about the 20th century. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but there's going to be a communist revolution that takes place, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. But apparently, you don't need to know that anymore. So we're just going to move on. Finally, 6.7, ideologies of change and reform movements. So basically, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the intellectual challenges to the established order. In 6.6, we kind of looked at the actual events of revolution and resistance. Now we're going to look at sort of the intellectual underpinnings that are going to challenge this conservative order. All right, so the first thing that's going to challenge conservative order is liberalism, right? What are the goals of liberals during the 19th century? Well, quite simply, they want to create societies based on popular sovereignty, that the people are the source of governmental power, not tradition or just insistence that a monarch has always been in charge, so he always should be in charge. They're going to call for things like constitutions that limit the power of government, that spread government out, that you have a monarchy, but also like a representational assembly that are co-equals. They are going to call for things like protection of private property, individual rights, civil liberties, religious toleration, basically Enlightenment ideas that we have talked about earlier. They're also going to promote self-interest in economic affairs, which is a fancy way of saying capitalist, free market, free enterprise, the best economic system ever created, implementing those sorts of ideas. Now, there's going to be some conflict amongst liberals. Who gets to play in this new liberal sort of world? And basically, the bourgeoisie, who make up most of the leaders of liberalism, are going to say, well, it's for us. It ain't for the working class. They are a bunch of drunk fornicators who are childlike, and they wouldn't be able to handle the responsibilities that we are calling for. And so they are not going to let the working class play in their new bourgeois world, which is going to obviously create conflict that we'll talk about later on. Some leaders' names that you should know. If you see a document on the test and it says Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, these are examples of liberal philosophers during this time. So Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo. Off the top of my head, these are people I can think of that are associated with liberalism. The two mentioned in the course description, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. Also, and College Board loves this topic, the Anti-Corn League. Corn Law League, excuse me. So again, the corn laws are coming up. They are government regulation of business that the liberals hate because it is an artificial regulation of business in their eyes. Okay, now we have more radical elements in society, although when we use the term radicals to describe these people today, they would be very moderate, normal sorts of political views. And of course, these are mostly the Republicans that are going to exist during this time. What are the goals of the radical elements in society? Well, in the 19th century, they want universal suffrage. They want full citizenship regardless of wealth or property. So basically, they want democracies where every male citizen, or maybe woman, depending on who we're talking about here, has equal access to participation and is treated 100% equally. Now, the conflict I already mentioned is, do women get to participate in this world? Some are going to say yeah, others are going to say no, it will just depend. And some famous radical groups that are going to advocate for these changes, the Chartists, are going to be the first working class political organization that proposes universal suffrage. They will get shot down by Parliament, but eventually their ideas will be adopted. Flora Tristain is a French socialist / feminist who calls for women to participate in this as well. All right, then our next group, and the most fun group for the 19th century, the dreaded socialists, right? There are three types of socialists you need to know, so let's run through those real quick. But before we do that, just a general note, all socialist groups, regardless of their tactics, their number one goal is the redistribution of resources and wealth created by the capitalist bourgeois industrial system. They are for industrialization. They are against the way the capitalist system allocates those resources within society. That's a fancy way of saying too many dollars in too few of hands. We need to redistribute that wealth and share amongst everyone to create a more equitable society. All right, so the three different groups of socialists you need to know: the utopians, the Marxists, and the anarchists. The utopians are going to be people like Saint-Simon and Robert Owens. They are going to be people who think that you can create a better working environment by improving the conditions in factories, treating people better, basically a kinder, softer sort of capitalism. Utopian socialists may also be like separatists. They want to go and form their own communal places where they share everything amongst one another. Remember, we talked about this. Really not all that important. They kind of freak out the squares, but they don't really result in any like long-term historical success. The Marxists, on the other hand, are going to be a big force in European society. Unfortunately, we don't talk about the 20th century, so we're going to kind of cut this one short. But basically, Marx is going to propose a scientific socialism. He's going to say, hey, I have studied history, and the same thing repeats over and over again. Society is controlled by those who control the wealth and property. They make the rules. A revolution results in a new group coming to power. They rewrite the rules of society, which then creates the next underclass, and then the cycle repeats itself again. Marx is going to say, we just saw this process play out with the French Revolution. The bourgeoisie overthrew the aristocracy and now created the capitalist bourgeois-dominated society. But that has created a new group of people, the proletariat, who are not allowed participation, and they will rise up. But of course, Marx says that that's the final revolution because so many people will be a part of the proletariat that it will usher in a new era of classless societies with communal or shared property. Right? So Marx is an economic determinist. He believes that economics drives history and that whoever controls the wealth controls the rules of society. Finally, we have the anarchists, and the anarchists are going to say basically that we don't need government, we don't need capitalism, we don't need any of these things. What we really need to do is just get rid of those things and then create societies that are based on voluntary cooperation, right? And so anarchists, you know, they get kind of a bad name. People think that it means like no rules whatsoever. Not really. They were basically saying the modern state was unnecessary and that people should just come together and figure out rules for themselves. So there it is. That is a look at politics of the 19th century. When we come back to our next video, we will be looking at the actual reforms that are passed during this time, the reform movements and the effects that has on society, and the ways in which these conservative regimes are going to be challenged by these ideas, and many times they will adopt some of those things and create new rules, new laws, reforms, stuff like that. Until then, talk to you later.